I offer this podcast freely. Your support really makes a difference. To make a donation, visit reneemckenna.com. Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee LaValle McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about the danger of being nice. And the danger of being nice, particularly if we're attached to being nice and being seen as nice, is the illusion that everyone else is nice as well. And many of us have been acculturated, trained, taught to be nice in all circumstances, to all people, under all conditions, even to our own destruction. Because in order to maintain that kind of illusion of niceness, we need to either deny or stuff or internalize the selfishness, greed, fear, and intentional harm that exists on this plane of reality. There are predators and there is prey. And once we acknowledge that, we are much more prepared to not just survive, but to thrive in the environments that we move through. If the antelope on the plains of Africa think everyone is an antelope, then they're screwed because they're not going to be paying attention for the possibility of the lions or leopards that lay in wait, well disguised in the grass, just looking for that happy-go-lucky antelope that's not paying attention. Now, I've had the wonderful good fortune to have a daughter, and although conversations about gender, sexuality, and date rape are happening on levels that weren't even considered when I was a teenager, as I watched my daughter move from cute, athletic soccer player to voluptuous young woman, which can happen in one summer if you're actually paying attention, depending on the developmental scale of your own child. I remembered that transition in myself, and no one prepared me for it. When all of a sudden, walking down the street was like a wolf whistle alley, and people driving by in cars or sitting on the side of the road were making comments to me, I was completely unprepared. And although I kind of liked the attention, it took me more than one season to figure out how to navigate it, and I don't remember any grown-ups ever talking to me about moving from soccer girl to sex object overnight. And so whether it's helpful or not, I have made sure to have more than one very intentional conversation with my girl about this idea of being predator and being prey. And as a gorgeous young woman, she is the prey. And like those antelope out on the plains, you got to know there's predators around. Because if you don't, they will take you out. And girls especially are taught to be nice and kind and sweet and loving. And many of the predators of the world know that and will prey on that in particular. The fear of confrontation, of making a scene, of making anybody uncomfortable. Because nice girls expect everyone to be nice. And that is a completely unrealistic expectation in the jungle in which we live. Now, there are plenty of wonderful, kind, generous, intelligent, wise, and selfless people in the world. But if we are unaware that there are also depraved, depressed, angry, desperate, dysfunctional, and self-centered people out there as well, then we're walking around with one eye closed. And if you got one eye closed, then you aren't going to see all those lions off on the left. And so how do we keep both eyes open without walking around paranoid or hypervigilant? And the main principle here is a dedication to truth and honesty. Particularly an awareness of and a trust in what feels true for us in our own gut, in our own intuition, and ultimately in our experience. People lie with words all the time, but their actions tell the truth of who they are and what their motives are. Unfortunately, I have way too many clients that have been raped. And rape, sexual abuse, and sexual assault take many different forms. But one of the most common is a young woman and a young man who've had too much to drink, and she's been trained to be nice and wants people to like her, and he makes unwanted advances and she doesn't know how to put a stop to it in a way that really puts a stop to it. Some people never actually learn how to say no, and mean it and follow it up with empowered action that stops whatever it is that we don't want to have happening. And so I've heard many stories, tragic ones, of young women who thought they were saying no, and that no was completely overpowered. And before they knew it, they were having sex they did not want to have. And in that shock, disempowerment, and confusion, because they've been trained to be nice, they never even talk about it. I have a client, Marta, just moved in with her boyfriend. They're engaged to be married. She came to me plagued with anxiety and suicidal thoughts. Very high-functioning young woman. She's a physical therapist, raised as a nice Catholic schoolgirl, very concerned with being kind and loving to others, and a victim to what you might call the golden shadow of Catholicism, which is this idealized perfection of Mary. The Virgin Mary was the ideal of womanhood, always kind, perfect, long-suffering, sexless, of course. And so this young woman is mortified, totally doesn't understand these really dark thoughts that she has. And over time, we've come to make friends with these dark thoughts. And they started, not too coincidentally, after she was date raped in college. Never confronted the boy, internalized the whole thing. And as we have made friends with those demonic voices in her head, they have revealed themselves to be her own suppressed truth and actually an empowered warrior part of herself that got twisted up and turned on her. And it has become quite empowering for her to befriend and include this bold, no-nonsense, really boundaried part of herself in her life. One of the doctors that she worked with at the clinic was actually being quite abusive to her. She became anxious even to go to work. And this doctor had been asking her to do things that weren't on her job description, and making disparaging comments to her about other staff was really inappropriate. And she had started to spin out with these self-hating, self-deprecating thoughts in her head. And when we pulled them out and asked that energy if it could be helpful to her, what was really going on, she was suppressing her own very healthy anger at being disempowered in this work environment. She was suppressing it with fear of not being liked and actually disempowering herself. And this warrior part of herself was furious at not being allowed its appropriate place in her life. And when we invited it in, she shows up as this kind of naked, wild woman. And what would she say to the doctor? She said, "I'd tell him to fuck off." "You can't talk to me that way. That's not my job. Who do you think you are?" And her work is to find a way to incorporate her own integrity and truth and empowerment, and to let go of this facade of being nice. And we all have that sense of truth within us. I think of my friend Carrie, came from a big family, a lot of cousins, and one of her aunt's husbands was creepy. They all felt like he was creepy. Years later, come to find out, creepy Uncle Paulie had actually raped one of the younger cousins. Nobody ever talked about it because it wasn't nice. And that cousin got to grow up and die of a drug overdose. I don't mean to be all gloom and doom here, but there's often a difference between how we wish people were and how they actually are. And it's best to dedicate ourselves to what feels true to us, kind of no matter what. When I was a little kid, I used to get to walk home from my elementary school for lunch. And on Tuesdays, my mother would take me down to this little lunch place down the street. And my mother was a very cute little thing. I was probably about 8 or 9. And I remember there would be this creepy old guy. And he liked my mother. And sometimes he would come and sit with us for lunch. It was so uncomfortable. He had a big mole next to his nose and he would play with it. It was so gross. And my mother would just make nice with him. And eventually I'd have to go to school and that would end the lunch with creepy guy. It didn't happen every week, but I always thought, why does she let him sit here with us? And I guess it was more uncomfortable to say, "I'm sorry, you're not welcome to sit with us," than it was to sit uncomfortably for 25 minutes having lunch. And although I may have used up all of my or be superficially nice cards in my life, I certainly spent many years struggling with being nice over being emotionally honest and honoring what felt true for me. And perhaps the place where being nice over being honest can be most pernicious is in long-term family and intimate relationships, where we develop patterns of superficial pleasantry, which not only avoids deeper dysfunction, addiction, neglect, or abuse, but actually holds it in place. And I think about this long relationship I had. It was actually a friendship from childhood, continued into adulthood, and we kind of grew in different directions. And for much of the early time in our relationship, the dynamic was her having a lot of drama in her life and me listening to it and supporting her. I am a therapist after all. And over time, as I grew and evolved, I kind of came to see that the drama that she had was like a habitual, perpetual pattern. And that maybe that was even how she interacted with people, was just around drama, problems, tragedy. And by that time, I was pretty dedicated to outgrowing my own drama and trauma addiction. And I wasn't too interested in listening to it in my spare time from someone who wasn't actually engaged in getting better. But I also hadn't yet grown the cojones to confront her. And so I just started to avoid her phone calls and kind of dread getting together. That our relationship was just her being in a position of need and me making nice. And so I had to realize that I was being emotionally dishonest. And so I had to let that relationship go. And there was a series of pretty intense, dramatic events that happened in her life. And I decided for the first time to not show up for her in the way that I always had, because it didn't feel authentic to do that. And it ended the relationship. And from her perspective, it was not nice. And so in order to stay in my own integrity, I had to let her see me as out of integrity. And although I don't always love this phrasing, there is the idea that what other people think of me is not my business. And my job is to stay as best I can in my own integrity on my own side of the street. I'm going to end with a redeeming story. Back to my daughter, navigating the streets of Manhattan as a beautiful young woman. Recently, she was on the Upper East Side after a party, walking to the crosstown bus, and she noticed that there was a guy following her, because she does, as best as possible, keep both eyes open. And so she crossed the street, but she missed the bus, and she didn't see the guy anymore. So she decided to wait for the next bus, which comes about every 5 minutes. And a group of about 5 or 6 young men came up to her and they said, "Hey, we noticed this guy's been following you and he's actually still across the street." And she was a little surprised because she thought he was gone. And they said, "So we're going to wait here with you until the bus comes or until you take an Uber." And they didn't even talk to her. They were just off by themselves, keeping an eye on her. And she got on the next bus, said thank you, good night. And so we must always remember that there is much goodness in the world and keep our eyes open to the valor, generosity, and integrity of others, just as much as we must be aware that there are those who are violent, dangerous, and who will disempower us if we don't have our own wits, our own intuition, and our own inner warrior intact. And so where do you need to grow in awareness? In personal empowerment, in the willingness to be not nice in the face of the bad motives of another. And it's my experience that as we grow in that courage and integrity, we grow in faith in the courage and integrity of humanity as a whole, because the antelopes do outnumber the lions. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, consider dropping 5 stars on Spotify or a good review on iTunes. I just started a YouTube channel. There's a link to that in the show notes. My year-long mentorship program starts this Friday. I'm so excited. And I'm putting together a calendar of upcoming workshops and events that'll be online. You might want to sign up for my weekly newsletter, info@reneemckenna.com. Deep gratitude to my supporters through this podcast and on Patreon. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.